Good evening, friends. Welcome back. And probably some of you know that what we're presenting here from Pune every Tuesday for the next 3 more weeks is a series on health and vitality. And last week we spoke on the topic of gaining energy in our lives, how we can draw it, what it might mean, what are the different sources we know. And I had touched upon very passingly in a statement that chanting, affirmations, and silence, which I had mentioned in the topic of brahmacharya, that conserving our usage of energy through the senses also has deep healing power and potential. And this evening I want to emphasize and focus a little bit more specifically on this topic of music, sound, silence, and then healing that comes in the proper usage of these things. So let's begin with this topic of music. I am reading a book. It's called Ophelia. It's written by a doctor who's a neurologist and also a psychiatrist, now in his 70s. And it's quite an interesting book, and there are many things shared in that book. But one thing that really struck me was the mention of this doctor, who also, by the way, comes from a very talented family of musicians, and he loved music. He grew up, and as you can imagine, he's of an age that he has experienced music. He lives in America. He has, gone through these different music, waltz, and then pop and rock and jazz and all this, and then heavy metal, as many of you will know, the kind of music we have. To begin with deep classical, as I said, waltz music. And he has presented some facts over there, and he says, earlier, if you wanted to listen to music, he said you would have to go out. First, it was not easy, like today we have it online or in the phones even. He says you had to go out and purchase a gramophone, then you had to maintain it, you had these, discs to buy, you had to preserve them very well, and there was a lot of effort involved even in initiating the process of listening to a song. And he says, so one was very intentional about what he or she was listening to. But he says in our times today, I think our greatest challenge is not gathering the gramophone or dusting it, but he says preventing ourselves from the barrage of music that comes through ringtones, advertisements, television, online promotions, and so many things. And I'll mention at some point of the effects he has seen. We all know that music can have good as well as deleterious effects on us, but he mentions some very serious ones, and I'll come to them. But what is music? Almost everybody that I've known in my earlier years in college, I myself, we all like music of one or the other kind. And people say, how can this kind of music be deleterious? For example, people, by the way, can like any kind. They can train themselves to like different things. And I say that because, especially in today's time, you see a whole younger generation, which, if pointed out, the deleterious effects of music, would say, "Oh, but that's the kind of music I like. That's the kind of music I enjoy. It makes me happy." So one has to put their mind: how happy is it making you? Happy in what sense? Is music? Is it affirming your identity? Is it resonating with the moods that you're feeling? Is it resonating with the consciousness you're seeking? There are so many factors involved. And yes, if somebody is feeling low, Swami Kirandaji used to give us this example of the song that was aired on radio in 1940s in America. It was called Gloomy Sunday, quite a obviously gloomy name. And Swami says, believe it or not, it had to be pulled off air because many people day by day were committing suicide, and the common thread was they had listened to this music and it made them feel gloomier than their present state. So music can reinforce that quality. And today, for example, we also have these very wonderful experiments which we should know about, because in a few minutes I will talk about how music, which has been claimed by many wise people, scientists also now, many musicians for sure, is claimed to be that one form of art which probably has the greatest effect, direct effect on human consciousness. So let's see how we should be careful, and what has science got to tell us about music. Well, we are all familiar with this experiment that was conducted now decades ago. It has now been conducted on greater areas of plants. First two plants were taken, one, and the speaker was covered. It was placed around the pots, and classical music was played on a very low, light note for a few days. And it was noticed that this growing plant moved not only towards the speaker, it actually wrapped its tendrils around the speaker as if to embrace that kind of music. And actually that was waltz, which Swamiji says has a very childlike tonality to it. So that was the music that plants, which are of course living, they appreciated. On another level, when hard rock music was played, or heavy metal, which is still worse, the plant in some cases died, and died by bending on the other side. It tried its best to avoid that vibration, which is so harmful. So if it can cause that to a plant, imagine its effect. People have done similar experiments on water, observing its crystals, the shape of the crystals when different music has been played, and on one side they saw beauty when beautiful music was played, uplifting, inspiring music was played, and a lot of disharmony and ugly shapes of the crystals when something which was confusing, erratic, which had no sense, which was downward pulling. Actually, one very good sign of identifying a catchy but very deleterious effect of form of music is the thumping beats. That Swamiji says that is affirming the ego. And an ordinary person says, well, what's wrong with the ego? Well, if you understand that the ego, yes, we all have an ego, but it is at some point, a limitation. Or let me put it this way, we have to move with whatever ego we have and first make it healthy, make it expansive, make it enjoyable. When you meet somebody, if you ask them, are you happy or are you enjoying what you're doing? They should not take a pause to think that, yes, maybe, I think so, well, I'm listening to this music so I feel better. When you are feeling nice, when you're uplifted, that's the vibration we are in. And that is, so the ego has to be enhanced. And ultimately, but you can think of the ego even as preoccupation. If we are caught up in ourselves, if we are in a mood which is, you might say, intensified, feeling, then we are caught up in that, and we are not thinking of other people. Sometimes we are not speaking to other people. So music has this effect. Music also has been shown actually in a very startling experiment. One scientist who was also a musician, he unraveled the DNA of a plant that had loved music, and then he wrote down he observed the notes of that music, and he matched the two to see that the notes of the music was how the DNA molecules had arranged themselves, on that structure, DNA structure. The molecules themselves had arranged themselves like that. And just to the mind, it will make no sense actually, unless you of course read that article and see the pictures yourself. Then he showed another piece of music where the musician later accepted that he had deliberately tried to complicate the music, and believe it or not, it was resonating with the genome or the DNA structure of some cancers. So, it speaks of, again, the effect music can have. Swami Karandaji repeatedly would say that, music is its own language, it's a different language. He, of course, many of you would know, performed over, made over 450 pieces of music. He was a composer, he was a singer. And he says that again and again when he and his music was performed in different countries, he says people who were from a different language altogether, who never understood what I was saying, he said even they came up to me sometimes with tears, congratulating, complimenting me on the beauty of the music. And he says, in the beginning I would ask, but you didn't even understand the words. And he says, that doesn't matter, I understood this was on love. And Swami says, actually I understood it too, because that is what I had composed it. I had composed it with that intention, for that feeling. For example, Swamiji has composed a series called Secrets of Love. He describes the different facets and aspects and the ways in which we experience love through different relationships in that CD, and it's entirely instrumental except for one song. So he tuned into those aspects, and then silently through the vibrations, you might say, that is conveyed to the listener. So then we can see that yes, you can apply your mind to understand the lyrics and the composition, but then music also has a way of penetrating through the heart. As a doctor, I can tell you music is something that works on the right side of the brain. It's a right-sided brain activity, not the regular rationalizing and planning that we do through the left side. So it has that quality also within itself. I'd like to talk a little bit about the noise, that we face often, and what it's because music is considered chiefly to be something which is inspiring and uplifting, and ideally it should be like that. But when performed in an improper way, in a random or confusing way, or in a too loud a way, that is what is defined as noise. And just last week, I chanced upon this statistic in a magazine, which was from World Health Organization, and it said 1.1 billion people, which is 1/7 of the world's population, is at a very high risk of developing or getting into premature deafness. And that was it mentioned, and I went to the site, I could not find out further details, but I thought, what must be causing it? For one, urbanization is happening. Practically, their purchasing power is increasing. They are going into, vehicular transportation, which is of course unavoidable. But we are moving so much. There are so many things moving, so many machines being produced, so much construction happening, so much industrialization, urbanization, and as I mentioned in the beginning, so much music, advertisement happening, that somewhere it is affecting us very deeply. And on a similar note, I would like to share that when Yoganandaji, my guru, he was alive in United States, he was once with the mayor of Chicago, and the mayor told him that, sir, if people in our city were, slightly a few miles beyond the city limits, their lifespan would increase by 10 years. And he started a whole campaign around that people should once in a while, especially during weekends, go out in nature, be in silence, or try to maybe even talk less or listen less to music. Swami Kirananda would often rejoice in telling, how people, it's hard, our minds can confuse us, especially when our feelings are disturbed, when our emotions are disturbed. We often seek the exact opposite of what is necessary for us to calm those feelings. And he said people would go to a beach but carry their big stereo system, this was in his times, and he would say, or they would go to a forest and then again play such music, even if on low sound, where he says they could not simply enjoy the wind or the chirping of birds or the lapping of water maybe by the shore, by the lake. And so many of these things are often missed when we try to constantly embroil ourselves in noise. Let me also now tell you a little bit about the effects that the physical body can go through, because today we are especially talking about the healing aspect. The physical body, we have this heart system, we have a regular heart rate, and often now people understand that the slower it is, the better it is for us. It is more calming, it is actually more relaxing, and athletes who put in some effort into training themselves, they enjoy quite a reasonable and restful period than later on if they've trained their heart in a certain way. But then if we are exposed to loud music, and think of yourself, if suddenly somebody catches us unaware in a kitchen and they come from behind, their gentle greeting may sometimes strike fear in us, and because the body is not prepared for it. Likewise, as a doctor, I can tell you, I often have to come in some ambulance or receive an ambulance with a patient, and whenever I've taken a patient and I know that it is not absolutely mandatory to run the siren of the ambulance, I just put it off. And the patients have told me, because I asked them, they said, I was feeling so much better when it was off. Of course, when you're in traffic, you have to play it. But certain sounds, and especially loud sound and noise, it increases our heart activity, heart rate, the respiratory rate increases. It also induces the release of cortisol, which is the stress hormone in our blood. And cortisol leads to tensing of muscles, headaches, tension, increased blood pressure. If it's over a period of time, and imagine somebody working in an industry, or sometimes people these days, their profession itself involves dealing and playing loud music all the time. And what do? They will be exposed even to insomnia and, of course, deafening, as you can guess. Recently there was a big gathering in the place where I work, and I was invited there to tend to about 2,000 people who had come for a function. It was daytime and I couldn't believe how people had paid so much money and they were listening to this music. I was about 150 meters away from the speakers in my medical tent, and thrice my phone, which I had kept on the couch next to me, fell. And it fell because of the vibrations of the music. And of course you can imagine I was sitting there with these earphones. I was prepared by another doctor and I had gone there, but they were playing such loud music. I said, if my phone is moving out of the vibrations from such a distance, what must be happening to people's hearts and their blood pressure? But like I said, the human mind is so skillful in confusing itself that, oh, this is what I'm seeking, because unfortunately that is how we might be feeling somewhere inside. Let's go now deeper into some other effects that noise might have on our brain and our memory. I was speaking about this book in the beginning, and the doctor over there, he was mentioning that, as people's age and lifespan is getting prolonged, he says it's like new illnesses are coming to our notice, or new symptoms and manifestations. They are very few, but he says they are giving us an insight of how much we are affected by the environment we were even born in, brought up, and things we were exposed to. Giving the example of music, he says he is many times receiving patients who have a seizure, which is a fit, and before a seizure, many people come to know that in the next few minutes they will get a seizure. And he says more and more of my patients are reporting that they get this feeling by listening to a certain kind of music. And it need not be the kind of music or the song which they've heard before, but they say that it was of a similar vibration, and I knew that something was going to happen. And later on, sure enough, the friends and relatives said that they told us that this was to play this down, or it was going to cause something like that. On another level, this doctor was suggesting, sharing that many people are coming with complaints of listening uncontrollable repetitions of either full songs or small segments, and this is happening in people who are often over 70 years of age. And he says the patients may sometimes say, I heard this song just a few times because my person in the office used to play this, or somebody's car they used to play it, and some very few times they liked it, but often it was unpleasant to them. And he was saying that it would now come again and again and again to them. Nursery rhymes are coming to some people after decades of forgetting the whole sequence of words and such. So what he was saying is that if we are seeing a proof that music is affecting us to such a degree, why don't we at least switch to the right kind, to that kind of thing which might, even if it has to repeat uncontrollably, at least it should be a good sound. For example, Swami Krandaji, who lost some external hearing towards the end of his life, he would say the only benefit of losing your hearing is that you're quite disturbed by other sounds. Also in yoga, there is something we experience called the inner sounds, the sound of Om and other things which I talk about. Those sounds which are so harmonious, they are actually nature, or you might say God, implanted within our very beings. Those sounds come to the fore. Of course, just to mention one last thing, this doctor was also mentioning that some people can go into hallucination because of sound, and it could be visual, it could just throw them off. So be very careful about the sound you're exposed to or what you're listening. Now, this discussion may make us wonder, how is it that somebody's composition is making us affected like this? For example, I'll tell you another story, a true story. One time, a musician who was a friend of the doctor I'm talking about, he wanted to perform for an elderly home, and so he was invited, and he started playing one of his favorite music after he had played a few for them. And at a certain point, he noticed that one of the elderly gentlemen quickly got off, and carrying his handkerchief out of his pocket, he left the room. And he felt disturbed. So when this music was over, this gentleman approached him and he says, "Sir, I'm sorry, were you all right? What happened?" He says, "I was about to come to you myself to ask, what made you compose that music? And he says, well, it's a long story. I think it was, he lost a relative or somebody, or maybe a person he used to adore. He lost him in the World War II in an airplane crash. And he says, it was to his memory that I composed this music. And the person said, believe it or not, that music reminded me. He said, I'm a fighter pilot. I was a fighter pilot in World War II myself. And that music reminded me of the sight of my friend's plane going down in the Pacific. And he says, after decades of forgetting that whole experience, I was stunned how that memory came vividly as a vision almost in front of my eyes. Actually, this experience, this sharing made that musician think that he had put that thought into that song, and maybe the song had gained the power, had the power to evoke a similar feeling in the listener. And Swami Kiranandaji used to say that is absolutely the case. He says, when you think of something and you compose music, he says those vibrations are carried. Now the mind may say, how is that possible? Well, let me give you an explanation that Yoganandaji offered and the Indian scriptures offer. Yoganandaji said that when this universe was created, when God created the universe, when he created things, he says it was a vibrationless state, and from that state, he says, the thought of his was manifested. Then he says it was given further energy and it was manifested as light, as energy. And finally, those vibrations were condensed enough to bring them to a physical reality. You might think of it the same way that we would make anything, a pencil. Somebody envisions the pencil, the length, the color, the thickness, the shape. Then he puts energy into making that pencil, into cutting it in a certain way, painting it, marketing it, and finally it is there, as a physical reality. And Yoganandaji said that very few people realize, because often, we see a lot of restlessness outside. He says, people do not realize that even their thoughts are nothing but a vibration. He says there's a vibration they can cause. He says, actually, if you're very still, sometimes think of this, when you're sleeping very peacefully, or if you've seen a baby, you may be sleeping very carefully, and suddenly they experience a bad dream, which is a bad thought, we can say. And suddenly they wake up and their breath becomes rapid, and suddenly, they start even crying and getting so emotional. It is because the thought has that power, and it's a vibration. Likewise, you might say that when somebody thinks of a certain music and he puts it into the form of a composition, it carries that power. And that's why there are, in India, this whole tradition of chanting, of repeating mantras, repeating sacred words, words which have been spiritualized, we can say, or sanctified by a very saintly person, by the scriptures, or power. A mantra is a word or a group of a string of words which has its own inherent power. And the scriptures are replete with examples of the effects that come when a certain mantra is spoken. That when you repeat this is what you will get. And Swami Kiranandaji shares a very beautiful example. There was a devotee in our community in America who, listened to Swamiji's music, and she was quite fond of this one particular song. It's called Sri Ram, Jai Ram, Jai Jai Ram Om, Sri Ram, Jai Ram, Jai Jai Ram Om. And she would play this music again and again and again. And she had I think a 2 or 3 year old son, and the kid must be playing all the time in the house around this music often. And at one point he was being reprimanded by his mom because for some mistake, and in the middle of this reprimand he looks up to his mom and he says, Sri Ram, Jai Ram, Jai Jai Ram Om. And he repeated the entire song to her, and she was stunned by what he brought up. And she came to Swamiji and she says, sir, what might this mean? And he says, oh, that song has vibrations of calmness and peace inducing, vibrations, quality. And he says your child and children, they are not so engrossed in the ego or the restlessness, as I mentioned. So the child was always tuning into that reality. He may not have understood what Sri Ram Jai Ram means, but he understood the vibration of those words. And when that need arose, he was chanting it back to his mom, which is to say that he was conveying that vibration, calm down, calm down. So what a beautiful example of vibrations or consciousness being carried through music. So that is the power of a mantra. Sri Ram Jai Ram is a very ancient mantra. Who knows when it was invented? But if it is being chanted again and again, Mahatma Gandhi used to swear by it. He wrote a whole book on Ram Naam. He says it has healed so many people. He says I practiced medicine on countless people using Ram Naam, and he said I've healed people of mental fears, psychological fears, spiritual despondency, physical ailments. He says this is a spiritualized word, and when repeated using the tonality of our voice, he says it can bring about that change. Chanting or repeating the Lord's name or repeating a mantra, adding music to any powerful word or a quality, it can produce its effect, but there are some things that we have to bear in mind, which are, you might say, universal principles to attain success in anything. One is, of course, you should be clear about what you're seeking. You should have faith in its working. You should have understood what that word or what that quality stands for and to what degree you need it. You should be open to allow that vibration, that consciousness, that energy that will flow through those vibrations of that music to affect your consciousness. Then, of course, if you're chanting it, then you should apply your willpower to it, your concentration to it, your feelings to it. If you are, of course, listening to somebody's composition, it's very good actually to make sure what the consciousness of the person is or the composer is. Don't be too finicky. Once I saw a lot of disturbed emotion in the car which I was traveling in. We were listening to certain lyrics of a person who sang Bollywood music also and a lot of spiritual music. And one of the members in our car, they said, please turn this music off now. And we're like, what happened? What happened? He's like, no, I know this person and he used to drink occasionally. And he's like, well, it's okay, give the guy a chance, it's coming out well and it's not disturbing, or inducing any such strong effect on us. Plus, just the way it was projected, that turn it off now, we cannot stand it. There was a lot of, disharmony there again. I'll talk about the human voice. What are the, effects of the human voice itself can have on us. But let's come back to the concept of chanting. When we are chanting, in our spine, in our body, there are energy centers called chakras. And these can be felt, actually experienced and deeply understood and experienced during meditation and yoga. But let's say for now, let me just go about explaining that one of them is situated near the heart center, the other is near the thyroid gland in the throat, and the highest center, the sixth center of the spine, is located at the point between the two eyebrows. Now, as you can guess, the heart one stands for love and the feeling aspect of our nature. This one stands for peace and calmness, and this is for concentration, where we apply our minds, our willpower, intelligence and such. And Swamiji says, whenever you sing, whenever you're chanting a mantra, whenever you are applying a prayer to music, he says, first, feel it resonate in your heart. Then he says, bring that quality into a peaceful vibration and calmness and oneness with other people. He says, bring it over here. And finally, he says, don't just bring it out of your mouth, physical mouth then. Project the vibrations of that music through the spiritual eye. He says, that way you will feel deep inner peace, joy. This is also the seed for joy. You will feel that joy as an underlying current. Swami Kiranandaji once told us that at a certain phase of his life, he was going through a lot of sadness in his heart. And he says, but he was a very good singer. Many people knew that. So a friend of his invited him and coaxed him to sing. And Swami thought, well, if I sing, I'll make people sad. So, but nonetheless, he was asked, so he sang 2 songs. He says, later I was surprised by people coming to me and telling me, thanking me for the joy they felt through the song. And he says, I told myself, joy? That must be the last thing you should have felt. And he says, but then he says, when I thought about it, I realized that years of yoga practice had brought about that flow of energy up my spine, up my chakras, and to such a degree that even under my superficial or temporary sadness, there was an underlying current, he says, of deep and calmly flowing joy. And he says, I realized anew the hope that the spiritual path and these practices promise. And that was a beautiful testimonial he gave. So again, remember that chanting through the chakras and through these things. Let me now speak a little bit about how the human voice, can be utilized. Because often, like when I came to the spiritual path, I remember I was asked by a fellow monk on the third day of my arrival, would you like to sing? And I said, sure. But look at this, in the 26 years of my life till then, I had never sung a song. I was never into any musical instrument. And I just thought, who replied on my behalf in that moment? But the thing was, music is, there is a power to, good music that just draws us into it. There's an aspect of us, we are made of vibrations. We are the matter form which was created by God's consciousness of joy. And we would like to express ourselves through that. Now, yes, if you can play a musical instrument and play it well, that would be a great service to yourself and to others. But guess which is that one instrument which we all have? It's our voice. And Swamiji says the Indian scriptures, they uphold this as the greatest instrument that ever was made. Which instrument could in a moment's notice express a deep mood, a grief, a longing for friendship, a desire to be understood, or aspiration for the divine, or just joyful, enjoyment of amusement, you might say, of some fun that we're having, of roaring laughter. It is this simple instrument. And yet, so many people, I've heard them say, oh, but that's my voice, that's how I am. Well, this is not my voice. My voice was not like this, and I'm always working. How can we use or modulate it to such a degree that it uplifts us, inspires us? My chief inspiration actually comes from a lady who I never saw, but I being tall, I used to sit at the final row of a tuition class, and many years ago, and whenever water would come in the neighborhood, it was this lady's responsibility to alarm everybody because it had come for a short period. And her voice would pierce through walls and roofs to reach every household. But it would go through the window, it would come through the window where I was sitting first. And I realized, I said, how could anybody bear this voice themselves and such? And my lesson came subconsciously, you might say, at that time, that one should have a soft voice, a voice which induces calmness. I have seen many patients in my practice with many other doctors who have said to the doctors right there, sir, I know, especially patients of neuropathic pain who are feeling a lot of pain which does not go by ordinary medicines. And these patients say, sir, why, as long as I'm in front of you, I'm not feeling the pain, but I know the moment I'm gone, it will come back. Which again, then I didn't understand what it means. I thought it was he was just expressing goodwill, but now I know this is the power or the calmness that is induced. Yogananda ji said when the voice is used in the right way, it has the power to manifest what is spoken through it, what is intended to be uttered through it, and or to bless other people, to change the vibrations, induce calmness, like I said, induce hope in people. What a gift! And of course, we can use this for chanting also. So think about this. Think about the gift we have in our voice, and let's work on that. And while we are speaking of voice, I would like to, as I've touched on the healing aspects of music and sound, I'd like to speak a little bit about the inner sound of the chakras and how we can achieve greatest healing of body and mind in deep silence. Now the chakras, by the way, the next class we will have will be on the topic of gaining health and vitality and healing through chakras and our mental attitudes. The chakras, I'll quickly go through them. They have a sound to each of them. The bottommost has a sound which is of a motor, or it can produce this bumblebee-like sound, and it can be heard in your inner ear when you're meditating. Our next higher chakra can make us hear the sound of a flute, and that's why the Krishna's flute is such a alluring, or when it is heard, it is said to be the sound that draws the soul inside towards inner peace and joy, God's kingdom within ourselves. Then we come up and we hear the sound in our Manipur chakra that of harps, of string instruments, the veena, the sitar, in the heart of a temple bell, of a church bell, in the throat of wind passing through, trees or small, branches. And finally, of course, the sound of Om, which is heard as a combination of all these and is said to be the most beautiful sound. It is said to be a sound which makes us realize how we were made in the first place. Yogananda said everything that is created ever is in a form of vibration. He says that primordial vibration is Om. It can be heard. In the Christian tradition, it is called Amen, the word of God. It can be heard. It is from that, with that, by that medium that God created manifestation. And if we are truly seeking inner silence, inner peace, joy, rest, healing in body and mind, then we must tune ourselves into this quality. I know of a friend who once went to meditate in the Himalayas, and later when she came, she was telling a group of us that after she had been in silence for a few days and done her meditative interiorizing practices enough, she says, at a certain morning I heard temple bells and I thought, well, okay, somebody's doing their rituals. And then she says, few minutes later, I heard the wind passing so strongly that I thought it was not alarming, she said, but I thought that some minor storm is brewing outside. And she opened her ears, opened her eyes to see that the trees were stand still outside the window. And she says, then I thought, what am I hearing? And she said, I closed my ears and this beautiful sound was there and it was getting louder and louder. And she said, but outside, she says, that contrast of stillness outside, like picture like through the window, and this wind blowing, she says, made me realize, because she had studied these teachings, that it was my oneness that I was feeling through the throat chakra. She says it was the most beautiful. She said, I played for it for about 20 minutes. Then I tuned into other sounds and they were all there. And she realized that what a beautiful thing this practice is. Paramahansa Yogananda ji said the Om vibration can heal us in the body for psychological tendencies and in our spirit. He actually went as far to promise that when we are in Om vibration, you are not just listening to God, you are with God, and hence no danger of any kind can touch you. I always marvel at that promise and at that possibility that yoga offers. Now we understand of the commotion I was talking about, of the restlessness people express, of the demands society is making on us, of the propulsion people feel in this world. And it's like you have to apply your will to stop for that. You cannot blame it, because the blame goes nowhere except that you suffer as time passes more and more. And on a similar note, when we interiorize ourselves, we come to a form of stillness. Years ago, when I was seeking spiritual understanding, and I'll close with this, I came upon this statement by a very well-known saint, Ramana Maharishi, in a book. The statement was, silence is the perennial speech that is often interrupted by talking. And I marveled at his wisdom. And as I applied that statement to whatever degree I could from that day in my life, I realized silence itself was healing. It itself was nourishing. It itself was reason to rejoice and enjoy our own selves. And meditation gives us that experience. You might say, last time we discussed, life force enters our body through the medulla and it permeates the nerves and the brains. If your nerves are shattered by jangling music and chaos outside and your thoughts and restlessness inside, how can healing be possible? Because those channels are clogged. Whereas if you release them through yoga postures, through exercise, proper eating, proper music, silence, meditation, then you will allow that life force to go to every aspect, every corner of your being, physical and otherwise. And healing is possible. True healing is actually ultimately only possible when Yoganandaji said, when human consciousness is open to understand what the divine has to offer and unites its consciousness to him. With that, I will end my satsang and a brief takeaway message that I'd like to share with you. I would urge the audience, a trend that we are seeing in Pune with some of our core devotees, they are purchasing harmoniums and learning how to chant. Another thing I showed you that ear muff. Try to see if you can use it. Once, I had a doubt if I need a ear muff. And guess what happened next morning? I was around Swami Kirananda, who had just given a talk, and as Swamiji came out of his lobby of the hotel to walk into a car, the only thing he was carrying in his hand was a ear muff, the same one as I showed you. And I think it was a silent answer to my doubt. And I thought, if Swamiji, who's hard of hearing, is carrying that, I think he was just giving a message, and he must be using it too, that we must protect ourselves from anything which is affecting our consciousness. God bless you.